The most important aspect of process of pigeonization is the simplification of the dominant language. This simplification, as we have already discussed, is because of this desperate need for communication among people who have no common language. Therefore, people who have no knowledge of the language try to use that very language to communicate, and it is possible only when they simplify the language in different ways. So, the simplification of the dominant language involves different features of the language, including grammar. The pigeon will have a simplified grammar, which means, for example, the structure of different sentence types will not be very different. A pigeon has fewer words. Some pigeons are said to have from 700 to 2000 words only. It also has less morphology. A pigeon will also have less morphology, which means the word forms will be very simple. There will be no inflections. For example, verbs will not be inflected to show different aspects of a tense. Similarly, pluralization may be missing from the nouns, etc. Not only that, the phonological options are also restricted. For example, the speakers or those who simplified language to use were not really very careful about the pronunciation. So the pronunciation is also restricted in range. Let's take a look at some of the examples of simplification of English before it emerged or before it began to be used as a pigeon. A pigeon will do away with grammatical redundancy, which means if, for example, we have a sentence like 2 big newspapers, 3 tall girls, the word 2 already expresses the plurality of the noun which is to come next. So even if there is no S with the verb, the meaning will be clear that we are talking about not 1 but 2 newspapers. So in a pigeon, this redundancy will be done away with, which means in a pigeon we will say something like 2 big newspaper and not newspapers. In French, this grammatical redundancy is even is found even more. For example, in English, the redundancy was only by the pluralization of the noun. In French, this pluralization is indicated by the adjective, the noun, and also the article. But the pigeon will do away with all this redundancy, and only one word which shows plurality, for example, 2, will be enough. So we have an example like the 2 big pepper, which means the 2 big papers. This is a sentence from, I guess, Cameroonian pigeon. Similarly, the vocabulary is also simplified. The vocabulary of the dominant language is also simplified. We have a word like bros to indicate a friend, especially a male friend. Show to mean to come, to arrive. A house to mean house. So if you hear a sentence like bros show my house, it means brother or friend come to my house. Similarly, house dog sick means hospital. So dog is considered equivalent to animal, which actually comes from the word dog. Sick is the same as sick. The house dog sick is hospital. There's also compounding of the nouns that we see in the pigeon vocabulary. For example, a dog baby will be a puppy. A cow baby will be a calf. To show emphasis, they use a lot of reduplication. For example, talkie-talkie will mean very talkative. Similarly, pigeon languages use a lot of circumlocution. Circumlocution, for example, if they do not have a word to express a certain meaning, they will say the same thing in a roundabout way. So, to refer to hair, they would say grass belong head, and to refer to mustaches, they would say grass belong mouth, meaning mouth. Let's take a look at some of the views that people have about these pigeons. People consider them as marginal languages, although there's a lot of interest now among linguists to the study of pigeons. They are still considered marginal languages. They're considered marginal languages because of the circumstances of their origin. They originated from slaves. They were used by slaves who were considered inferior, and only saying that the language belongs to slaves suffices to indicate how they are considered marginal because of their background. They're also considered marginal languages because of the knowledge which we have about them. Also, the attitude of the people whose dominant languages have been simplified to be used as pigeons, their attitudes towards these languages are also very scornful, and that also contributes to the viewing of these languages as marginal languages. Because of the simplification, some of the examples that we've just looked at, this reduplication, simplification of the vocabulary and grammar, they are not considered improvisations of the target language or the dominant language, but degenerations and deviations of the dominant language. Since these languages are devised by the desperate need to communicate by the people who had no knowledge of the language of which they are an improvisation, let's say, or a simplification, they are said to have been learned imperfectly. So people believe that they are not they do not give them a lot of, let's say, consider them in a position of prestige, because they believe these languages are imperfect because they are imperfectly learned. Just as the views about these languages are not very favorable, the views about the speakers of these languages are not very favorable either. People believe that speakers of these languages, pigeons, are deficient in many ways, culturally, because they come from the background which was deficient in many ways. They were slaves, they had no education, their socioeconomic status was very low. So they are deficient in terms of their socio-cultural status. They are deficient also in terms of education and knowledge. They are often considered ignorant people without education, uncouth and uncultured. And because of all these reasons, they are considered inferior to the speakers of other full-fledged languages. It is also believed that if these people have not been able to perfect this language or devise this language in a better form, if it is imperfectly learned, it is because of the laziness of these people. So let's take a look at the summary of the features of a pigeon language. A pigeon language has no native speakers. It has no native speakers because it is not anybody's first language. People devise it on their own. It has very limited use and simplistic structure, and therefore has very limited functions. It is also an adjunct language. Whoever uses a pigeon also knows another language.